Hello, caregivers. This webinar is going to focus on how parents raising kiddos with disabilities can protect their government benefits as they age. If that's something that you want to learn about, then let's get into it.
To get started, just a little bit about myself. I know Michelle said all of these nice things, but I did go to ASU and U of A, grew up in the Midwest, been practicing this is my 16th year of practicing law. And I'm a member of the Special Needs Alliance, as well as the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. And if anybody on here is ever looking for an attorney, those are great organizations to kind of search for somebody who's really focused their energy into some of the things we'll be talking about today and some of the things that probably come up in your lives. As I mentioned, our goal overview is to talk about government benefits. So a lot of times when we introduce these concepts, we're using acronyms, all this alphabet soup you can see up here. We're going to define what each of these things are and hopefully put together how they fit together, and then also talk about how we make sure we maintain eligibility or obtain eligibility if that's something we need. I imagine everybody who's joining today has children or grandchildren or somebody else who may fit into more than one of these categories, but kind of a broad spectrum of different ages. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of cover all these different things, but it is, to Michelle's point, something that you probably didn't anticipate you need to be an expert in, but by the end, hopefully you've got a firmer grasp on how these different government programs work together individually and can be protected. So that's my goal. You can see we're going to talk a little bit about Social Security. So Social Security, for most of us, our benefits fall into three big benefits as it relates to having a child or grandchild with a disability. So we've got SSDI, SSI, DAC, CHD. Some of you may recognize some of those, but we'll break them down, describe what they are. We're also going to talk a little bit about Medicaid. So Medicaid is our federal program that funds the state. In Arizona, we've got two big Medicaid programs, Access and Alltex. And then we've got a whole list of things that don't necessarily fall under one of those two categories, but DDD, SNAP, HUD, Veterans Benefits, and Medicare. And then, of course, down at the bottom, we've got what else, because there is always other programs that we want to make sure fit in and match in all these different areas. So that's our goal. We're going to start with Social Security. So before we hopped on, Michelle and I were chatting because Social Security is its own kind of unique organization. They tend not to really care what a court system might have to say. They don't care what Medicaid necessarily has to say, but Social Security is something that all of us are involved in on some level. And Social Security has kind of a broad spectrum of coverage for most, if not all, individuals eventually. So when we think about Social Security, many of us are thinking about the large chunk of our paycheck that we have to send off every month, which is our opportunity to fund Social Security for retirement benefits. It also is our way of purchasing Social Security disability insurance. So that's going to be the first acronym, the SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. And so for many of us on the call today, we've over the years received letters in the mail. Now we can get them through our online Social Security portal. That spells out if you or when you retire, here's how much you may be eligible for at different ages. And if you were to be determined disabled at this point, here's how much you would get in a Social Security disability insurance payment. And both of those amounts are going to be determined based on how much and for how long we have paid into Social Security. So how many of those pay stubs we've looked at and seen that some of our money was going to Social Security. And based on those numbers, then if or when we retire, we get a certain amount. And if we're disabled after we've paid in enough, then we're going to be getting an amount based on that contribution to Social Security. So what that means is with these two benefits, to a certain extent, we're in control of how much we might get. as it relates to retirement benefits, but Social Security disability insurance is really a factor of when we are determined disabled, how much we're going to get. Similarly, we also have another benefit that a lot of people will refer to as disability, and this is supplemental security income, SSI. Now you can see they're already confusing us. You would think with two acronyms with three of the same letters, those three letters would all match, but they don't. So supplemental security income is another program through Social Security, which is different than Social Security disability insurance. And in fact, eligibility for supplemental security income, or SSI, is intended for people who have not paid into Social Security enough such that they would get SSDI. So SSI is intended as an income measure for very basic needs. Food and shelter typically are the big ones. And SSI is a program in and of itself. And we're going to, of course, go over how they're different and how we might know which one we're getting. And then we also have disabled adult child benefits, so DAC, sometimes referred to as childhood disability benefits. If we kind of break that terminology down, we know that it's an adult who was disabled as a child. So we're going to talk about how we get there and how that works. And then, of course, survivors benefits. So if we have a minor child who is the survivor of somebody who contributed to Social Security, they may get survivors benefits as a nature of being a dependent at the time that paid or paid in and passed away. So that's kind of a quick big picture overview. Now we're going to break each part down. So first of all, if we look at disability, and I will say, Michelle, I just want to make sure, is anybody else having trouble hearing me? We got a note in the chat. But
yeah, you're coming through just fine.
Okay, I'll keep going then. So Social Security disability. So there are two big types of Social Security, Title II and Title 19. And so the definition, which all of those acronyms fall under, or primarily SSDI and SSI, is the same. And in this case, the law defines disability for purposes of qualifying for a Social Security disability program as the inability to engage in substantial gainful activity, SGA, by reason of any medically determinable medical or mental impairments which can be expected to result in death, or which has lasted or can last for a continuous period of not less than 12 months. So as we go through today, we're going to learn the terminology of disability, and the terminology of eligibility. For medical eligibility is going to be different amongst all the different programs, but for purposes of qualifying for SSI or SSDI, this is our current definition. Now, this does not mean that we can't work at all. And in fact, Social Security, if you're receiving benefits, is going to encourage work. They have programs like Right to Work or Return to Work. But the determination of disability is really that inability to engage in substantial gainful activity. There's another factor as it relates to disability in children, because of course, young children are not out working, at least not at this stage, in terms of getting paid, but there is a slightly different definition there. So if we break these down and we're looking at Social Security, the big question is what do I have? What should I have? And what in the world is going on here? For many, if we're looking at kind of a timeline or a spectrum from young age continuing through adulthood, there's going to be a few different changes. So on one end of the spectrum, if we're looking at young adults or children, we can look to see what benefit they're receiving. Now, typically, children who are receiving Social Security benefits are receiving one of two primary ones. The first is survivors benefits. So if our minor child has a deceased parent or parents, they may be receiving survivors benefits, which is not necessarily usually tied to a disability, or a minor child could be receiving SSI. Later on, we'll learn, but SSI does consider financial resources. And Commonly, when we have a minor child who is disabled, when they're under the age of 18, the financial resources that their parents have is going to be what we call deemed. That means that if I have a 5-year-old who is determined disabled, but I myself have a savings account and a retirement account and income, while my child remains under the age of 18, they're not going to be eligible for SSI until such time as they turn 18. Once they turn 18, then even if they remain living with me or in my household and I have the same job and the same financial resources, my assets and income are no longer deemed to them. Typically, that happens at young adulthood that we look at SSI. Later on, we're looking at SSDI, disability insurance, so somebody who's worked for a long period of time and contributed, or later in life when we're thinking about our young child's benefits, if they have a parent who has taken their own retirement, then we're talking about disabled adult child. So I'm going to kind of reference that timeline as we go through, but to start, we're going to talk about SSDI, so Social Security Disability Insurance. We remember that this is the one that we pay into, and so that if we're meeting the definition or criteria of disabled under Social Security, then how do we know if somebody's getting SSDI? So typically, one of the things that I'm going to look at is how much they're getting. Because those of you who may have dealt with Social Security will understand their communications in writing or on the phone or in person can somewhat be a bit confusing. And you get a lot of mail and it doesn't necessarily make sense. But if I'm looking at somebody's Social Security payment, I'm going to check. So how do I know if somebody's getting Social Security disability insurance? Either they're working currently. Now they may be getting Social Security disability insurance and currently working because remember, they might be a part of the right to work or return to work program, or historically they have worked. I also see that their benefit is typically over $914 a month. So this year in 2023, $914 a month is the amount that most individuals getting SSI get. I know that if somebody's getting more than that, they're not getting SSI, and it leads me to believe that potentially they're getting SSDI. Another benefit of being on SSDI is that after a waiting period, you do also become eligible for Medicare. So those are kind of some of the clues when I'm trying to determine what benefit is this person getting that I'm going to look at. Now, one of the good things about SSDI or Social Security Disability Insurance is that your eligibility for this program, because you've paid in, is eligibility based alone on your disability. SSDI does not care if you've got $1 million in a mansion. If you can't work and you've paid into the system, you're going to continue to get your SSDI. Now, of course, if you heal or your symptoms become manageable, then in that case, your SSDI could go away if you now are eligible to be gainfully employed. But SSDI does not have financial criteria. So good to know. And SSDI typically, like I said, falls into a stage later in life when people have paid into the working system. SSI is going to be what's probably most familiar for you and those you're caregiving for, because SSI is going to be the program that our young adults are receiving. SSI, Supplemental Security Income, is going to be a program that says not only do they meet the definition of disability, but they also meet the financial criteria. Because they have not paid into the insurance system, there's several pieces of criteria that need to be met. How do I know if somebody's receiving SSI? Well, one is that they're either getting $914 a month in 2023, or perhaps they're getting less than that. I also know that when somebody's getting SSI, they're going to be getting access healthcare coverage and in health insurance. And typically, individuals receiving SSI have little to no work history. So with SSI, in order to maintain our eligibility, the individual has to have less than $2,000 in countable resources. Countable resources generally entail what's in our bank account. Basically, we need to make sure we don't have any resources above $2,000 in our retirement programs, cash value in our life insurance. We are allowed to have a vehicle and we're allowed to have a primary residence so long as it has a certain value. However, given that they haven't updated this $2,000 limit in several decades, it's very hard to support either a vehicle or a home on less than $2,000 in resources because we're kind of out of luck in the event our air conditioning goes out in either case or something like that. But typically SSI, we're really being careful and monitoring the amount of accountable cash resources. So like I said, with SSI, we're thinking a lot of times either for families who have themselves low income or no financial resources before age 18, but most commonly, excuse me, for families that do have income and some resources, we're applying for SSI for our young adults after their 18th birthday so that the household income and assets don't count towards this. I will say, as we go through and kind of put this all together, SSI is probably the most sensitive program I worry about. When somebody comes in and we're planning to protect benefits, SSI is very, very sensitive. So, for example, the $914 a month. If our young adult is working, maybe they're earning $200 a month, that has to be reported and that will offset the $914, meaning their SSI will go down. If, for example, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but somebody is paying for that individual's food or shelter or rent or that kind of thing, then they're going to get a reduction of a third of their benefit. So a lot of people will say, I don't know why I'm only getting $600 a month and not the full 914. My guess, which is a pretty educated guess, is that Social Security determined that somebody else is providing food or shelter or that the individual is not paying for their own rent. And so they're making that in-kind support and maintenance reduction of a third. So SSI is super sensitive. SSI also will have the ability to retroactive ask for money back and penalize individuals who don't meet the criteria. So the worst case I can have is somebody coming in and saying, this individual's been receiving SSI for 5 years and they just told us they found a bank account that we didn't even know existed, and this whole time they've had more than $2,000, and now they're asking us to pay all of these years back, and frankly they'll get paid back. So we just really need to be careful with this SSI. Now, some people will come see me if we're during a transition period, we're looking at adult guardianship, and they're saying, well, you know, I've heard rumors about how sensitive SSI is and how hard it is to become eligible. And right now in our household, you know, we're able to continue supporting our child and we're not going to pursue that. And we're hopeful that as a young adult, they'll be able to work and that sort of thing. The hard part is that when we're doing this, we're losing an opportunity because one of the programs that comes into play later on in life is what we would primarily call disabled adult child benefits or childhood disability benefits. Now, this benefit is going to be kind of combining what we've talked about so far. The first thing is that our recipient of SSI, when they've been determined eligible for disability under Social Security before age 22, really 21, then we're going to make sure that when either parent starts to take Social Security or if they pass away, we're going to pursue disabled adult child benefits. How do we know if somebody has disabled adult child benefits? It's because they have a parent receiving Social Security or a parent who's deceased, and usually their benefit is over $914, and we have Medicare. We can kind of see these concepts come together. But the importance of this is what happens is that if Joe at 18 becomes eligible for SSI, and for the next 20 years gets SSI and parents are monitoring it, and then one of the parents takes Social Security retirement benefits, Because that determination happened before 22, then Joe's benefit is going to transition when that parent's benefit is going to transition. And what will happen is that Joe will receive Social Security computed and calculated based on that parent's payment into Social Security. How that works is if Joe's mother, Sue, has been getting or is eligible for $3,000 of a monthly benefit, then they'll calculate that. And Joe's former SSI of $914 is now going to become 50% of his mother's. And that is, in the easy math here, $1,500. And so if we look at that, obviously we know Joe got a raise. Joe is now getting more than 914. Now that SSI is going to go away because it's offset by the disabled adult child, but Joe's now getting $1,500. He also will be eligible for Medicare. Now he may still be getting access insurance a different way, but Medicare as well. And the benefit is no longer sensitive to Joe's income or resources. So this disabled adult child benefit turns more into the Social Security disability insurance nature, in the sense that we're now, because we're earning Social Security based on something that the parent has paid in for, it's a lot less sensitive. So we lose this opportunity to become eligible for disabled adult child benefits if we don't pursue SSI benefits as a young adult before age 22. So I encourage most families that once they've got the guardianship in place and their young adult is now 18 and their financial resources are no longer considered for calculation, to pursue SSI. Now, if they become independent and can work, great. That is wonderful. I am happy anytime we can get that Social Security out of our lives. But that being said, if our goals for independence and our hopes don't transition to full employment and we have to stay in Social Security system, I want to make sure that we can do everything we can for Joe in this situation to maximize how much he'll have. The other benefit of disabled adult child benefits is, while his mother, Mary, is alive and receiving retirement benefits, it's that 50%. If she were to pass away, then Joe's benefit will go up to 75% of that. And that's just too much math for a Saturday morning, but I presume you can do it. The other piece is that if Mary herself were to get Social Security disability insurance, then Joe also has an opportunity to receive this disabled adult child or childhood disability benefit. So, you know, for some of you, if you're young adults or your child is a young adult, then you're considering either maintaining SSI or applying for SSI. It's something we're considering. If you've got a young one still at home, then this is hopefully something we put in our back pocket and remember, you know, when they turn 18, what this is going to look like. If you're saying to yourself, you know what, my adult child is getting some number and I can't figure out what it is, it might be some combination of these programs. So in my earlier math, if, for example, Mary herself were taking Social Security retirement benefits, and in fact, her retirement benefit was $1,500, and now Joe is only getting 50% of that, Joe may be getting $750 of disabled adult child benefits, and then he may get another chunk of money to get him up to the $914 for SSI. So sometimes these programs can be combined. Another common scenario I see, in fact, my client earlier this morning, we had this situation where she's getting two different payments. About half of her payment is a disabled adult child benefit from her father, who has now passed away. And the other half is SSDI, because she's been working for a very long time and paying into the system. Now she's been paying in at a lower rate and less, so it's taken a while for her SSDI to build up. But the very confusing part about all of this alphabet soup is that it all fits together. Social Security doesn't tell you exactly what it is and how it is. And so we've got to somehow kind of disentangle these different benefits. And we know we've got to be really careful if somebody's getting any of that SSI. So we're going to transition and talk about Medicaid and some other benefits right now. But as we come to the second half of our conversation. We're going to talk more and more about, I'm looking at the clock because holy cow, I told you I could spend all day on this. We're going to talk about protecting all these benefits. So moving on, well, I say that and I forgot I have this slide in here, but I touched on it. In-kind support and maintenance. If you applied for SSI and they asked you, does your child pay you rent? And you said, of course not, they have no income yet. Then when you start to get SSI, sometimes you're only getting 2/3 of the $914. It's important that they do contribute to the household. How you manage that, that's a different conversation for a different day. But if you call them back and say, yes, Joe is now paying Mary rent, then we want to get that full $914 benefit. The other opportunity that sometimes we see this SSI go down is if the recipient of SSI is the beneficiary of a funded special needs trust, and the special needs trust is paying for food or shelter or something like that. So just important to know that if you're getting roughly 2/3 of the $914, it's almost certain that this is what they're charging you for in-kind support and maintenance. We got to figure out how they figured that and potentially change it. Sometimes it's intentional, but rarely is it intentional, I'll say. Okay, so switching over to a different acronym, DDD. I bring up DDD before I start talking about all text because I know for many individuals, DDD is what we think of, first of all, because we tend to have quarterly meetings with them and they tend to be the face of some of the services we receive. But what we'll learn here is that a lot of the benefit of DDD is paid for by all text. So we got to make sure we focus on that as well. But DDD provides support to individuals diagnosed with at least one of the following developmental disabilities during childhood. And thanks to probably some of you and the community, we added Down syndrome to this list. But these are the big areas where we have a diagnosis during childhood that allows us to become eligible for DDD, Division of Developmental Disabilities. Now, what does DDD provide? It provides a support coordinator that you meet with quarterly, service planning, advocating to obtain authorized services, facilitation of issue resolution, and assistance with assessing and determining the need for all text. Now, DDD without all text doesn't have a lot of services to plan for or support to coordinate. And so sometimes we'll have a child or a young adult who perhaps qualifies for DDD because they have a diagnosis of autism, for example, but they don't qualify for all text, so they don't in fact actually have a lot of services. And so we've got to figure out how we get services. So DDD has something a little more meaningful to do. And so that typically is when we're looking at qualifying for Arizona long-term care system benefits, or what is lovingly referred to as ALTEX. ALTEX, as I mentioned earlier, is a Medicaid program in the state of Arizona intended to provide long-term care system benefits. Similar to SSI, ALTEX has criteria for qualifying. They have both financial eligibility as well as medical eligibility. Now, for ALTEX, we're kind of changing our language from medical eligibility from disability that Social Security focuses on. And they are, in fact, looking for very different things. So there are many instances when somebody may be receiving ALTEX benefits, but they're not receiving Social Security and vice versa. But it's its own system and its own way of moving forward and qualifying. So to qualify for ALTEX resource and income requirements, it's a little bit different too, because these resource and income requirements apply to the applicant or the individual receiving services, essentially from birth, meaning even if they're under the age of 18, in this case, they're not going to look at the parents or other household members' income or assets like they do for SSI, but they are going to look at the individuals. And so in this case, again, we have this $2,000 limit, which will hopefully be going up soon. But right now they have to have less than $2,000. Excluded resources also include the tangible personal property, their furniture, their jewelry, their Xbox, whatever they have. A primary residence, again, how you support a primary residence with less than $2,000 is a tricky question. And I think one of the reasons why we're advocating for that $2,000 to go way up, but they're also allowed to have one vehicle, and then certain types of trust are considered excluded. Again, you can imagine, and I'm sure Care for the Caregivers has resources available. Certain trusts and how they qualify is its own conversation. We're going to talk about it a little bit today, but that is a loaded statement. Countable resources is going to be really everything else. So that's going to be cash, checking, savings, retirement accounts, UTMA and 529 accounts. So a lot of times 529 accounts are pretty common. We start saving for our children at a young age to pay for school. 529 accounts do not count for purposes of a countable resource until that individual is 21. So what that means is sometimes we'll have a funded 529 account and somebody's approaching their 21st birthday. We need to do a couple things. One is we could move that money into a certain type of trust for the benefit of the beneficiary. We also could transfer that money to another sibling that's allowed under 529 laws. But we've got to figure this out, because if our individual who might be receiving All-Tech services has had a 529 or UTMA account, it's been ignored or not counted until 21, but after 21, it's suddenly going to push them over the $2,000 limit. We've got to have a plan for that. Cash value of life insurance. Seems kind of silly to mention this for a young adult, but in some cases, I think it's less common now, but for a while it was pretty common, for example, for grandparents to buy a life insurance policy for a baby. Those policies may not have a huge death benefit, but over the years can accrue a cash value, and that cash value counts. And so sometimes if we've got that cash value, it's over $2,000, we know that's a big problem. But even if it's $700, then we have to be really careful, because we only have $1,300 that we're allowed to keep in the checking account. So, and then again, countable resources, certain trusts. Not trying to hide the ball on that one. It's just that trusts, there are a lot of different types and they meet certain different criteria. So again, we've got 3 big criteria for All-Techs. Whoops, I totally skipped over income. But we've got the resource criteria, and then we've got income. So the income in this case, the applicant must have less than $2,742 in monthly income. Many people say, oh, what do you mean? That's more than 2,000. So there is a difference between income and resources. Income is this higher number. Resources just means that at the end of the month, what carries over has to be less than $2,000. So their income is that high or close to that high, then we've got to be mindful we're spending on appropriate things for their benefit. That's something to know. If they're over income, which happens sometimes when, let's say, somebody is getting disabled adult child benefits and they have their own income, a number of different reasons, then we do have legal tools like an income only trust, or what's commonly known as a Miller trust, to solve that income problem. But income is its own financial criteria. Medical eligibility, this picture that's on the screen, if you can see it, is kind of a misnomer, because it's not at all true. They're not going to break out the stethoscope or have the doctor take your blood or anything like that. You go through a process called the pre-admission screening, and the pre-admission screening is typically with a social worker or a nurse who works for All-Techs. A lot of people will confuse some part of the DDD application process for the All-Techs process, because they tend to bleed into one another. And so, as I mentioned, part of DDD's job is to pursue the All-Techs benefits as well. And so what you frame as DDD or All-Techs may have some overlap in your mind, but this is the eligibility specialist is going to have a pre-admission screening handled, and that pre-admission screening is looking at non-psychiatric medical conditions or developmental disability, leads to a level of care which is provided in a nursing facility or intermediate care facility. So within that, we've got a lot of different pieces, but big thing to point out right here, because I see this a lot when I have families where somebody's getting denied for All-Techs, is, again, if we go back to the money and we're thinking about funding sources in the state of Arizona, the funding source for psychiatric medical and All-Techs is very different. So a lot of times if we've got somebody with 2 or 3 or more diagnoses, and some of them are psychiatric and some of them are developmental disability. We've got to focus on the developmental disability and how that impacts the questions they're going to ask us in the medical assessment, and try to leave out some of the more psychiatric in nature, because basically what will happen is each program will point at each other. Oh, you don't need all text, you need SMI services, or SMI will say, oh, you don't need SMI, you need all text. So we really have to focus and kind of break down some of these questions they're asking. So there's a number of different past tools. They are available through the Medicaid resource manual. They don't give us a ton of guidance on how they're doing this, but what we know and what our office, for example, participates in, and many of you have also participated in, is they're typically a verbal interview with the individual. They are also reviewing medical records, and they're asking a lot of questions. While I always advocate for parents to be honest and forthcoming when answering these questions, you need to be as honest about this person's ability to take on some of these tasks and skills without prompting on their worst day. We need to, I know from day to day, we support and encourage and maximize independence, and we're so proud of all the ways they've made improvements. But for this particular part of the benefits equation, we really need to think about how things truly are, especially if you weren't around, because we want to make sure we get these all text benefits. So honesty, but honesty for the worst days. If somebody has met resource criteria, income criteria, and passed the pass or passed the pre-admission screening, then we have eligibility for all text. This is the funding of the services and coordination of care that DDD is going to now coordinate. So we've got day support services, attendant care, home modifications, employment services for young adults, housing opportunities, home health aides, respite, that kind of thing, or residential support services. Also, if someone is eligible for all text, they are also now eligible for access. So somebody might not be receiving SSI anymore, excuse me, but they could be receiving all text and still have access. That means they could have access, all text, DDD, and Medicare and disabled adult child benefits or SSD benefits. So you can see that all of these things start to come together. And the reality is that throughout an individual's life, some are going to come in, some are going to go out. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a big puzzle. So what else in the brief kind of time I did focus on a lot of other benefits, but there are a lot of important ones. We know that a lot of individuals who perhaps are more independent may have financial assistance for housing that is not all text. A lot of times this is going to be Section 8 housing or HUD housing. These are federal programs that are largely driven by income, but their calculation of income is very complicated, and then they do count resources in a formula that your resources generate income. So that's something to be really mindful of. If suddenly we have somebody who's been receiving HUD or Section 8 housing and they have a big change in their resources or income. We have what are formerly known as food stamps, which is EBT, which is the SNAP benefit in the state of Arizona. This is also very largely income driven. It's changed a lot over the years and has gone down for a lot of people, but important to be mindful of that if we're suddenly our income's changing, that program may be impacted. Some individuals are going to be receiving access or Medicaid health insurance through access, but they don't have all text or SSI. There's a lot of different ways to qualify for access, but the big one is really just low income. So we need to be careful about that. Again, if there's a change in financial circumstances, it could impact all of this. And then finally, veterans benefits. And so if the individual is either was themselves a veteran and has now been injured or is disabled or is a child of a veteran, we need to understand what type of veterans benefits we're getting, because there's a lot of different pension benefits, survivors benefits, aid and attendance, a lot of different programs that fall under those veterans benefits depending on the nature of the veteran's service or injury or that type of thing. So those can all kind of complicate the factors here. And so we're moving on to protecting these benefits, and I know I'm going to review them again because there may be some questions, and at the end we'll get to the questions. We're looking at components of protecting these benefits. So one thing is savings and resources. We now know that if our child, grandchild, loved one is on SSI or Altex, we need to be really careful about savings and resources, because with a really low threshold, we want to make sure that savings accounts, 529, UTMA accounts are considered. And potentially, if somebody's receiving Altex or SSI and they're getting a settlement, whether that's a huge multi-million-dollar settlement or a fender bender $20,000 settlement, all of those things we need to be really careful in making sure that it matches, and we've done what we need to do to plan for that money. As parents or as caregivers, you need to be mindful of your estate planning and making sure that when you pass away, that either inadvertently or unintentionally, that the resources you have don't pass to this child, or now probably an adult, in a way that's going to disqualify them. Special needs trust, like I mentioned, there's a bunch of different types of trusts. We're going to go over 3 big primary ones today: special needs trusts, first party, third party, and how we fund them briefly. But like I said, I think Care for the Caregivers and myself, we have other webinars that are recorded that are specific to that particular topic. And then ABLE accounts, which I know were a hot topic a couple years ago and kind of have stayed that way. So trying to talk fast. Special needs trusts. So I see a few familiar names and faces, and if you've been into my office, you've probably seen this diagram here on the screen, but this is a tool I use when I meet with clients to talk about how we're going to use a special needs trust to plan for protecting our benefits. And so sticking with Joe here, if we have Joe there in the middle of the page, you can see that underneath we've got SSI, Altex, and DDD. That's actually kind of a test, because if you've been paying attention, we know DDD isn't sensitive to how much money Joe has, because DDD, is just coordination of services. But because so many of us think of DDD as being Altex, I wanted to leave it on there. So if we're trying to protect Joe's eligibility for SSI and Altex, we know he can't have more than $2,000 in his name. And so when we're thinking about, okay, we've suddenly got this money, either an influx of money from an inheritance, or hey, we want to plan for that inheritance, or there's a settlement, our first question is where is the money coming from? And I say that because we, as you can see on here, we have third-party trusts, first-party trusts, and ABLE account. Our options in how we protect this money will depend on legally whether or not the money has already been determined to be Joe's. So for example, if you're loving, I'll call her your mother-in-law, Mary's husband's mother left a very generous gift of $50,000 in her life insurance for Joe, and Grandma Barb passed away, and that beneficiary was Joe, and we can't change that anymore. Joe now has legally $50,000. Now, of course, we could just take a couple months and spend the $50,000. Maybe it'll last a year. Depends on what services we suddenly have to pay for and all that. But that money will go into, can only be handled a couple ways. So one is spending it, typically not what we want to do. The other option that's common is what we call a first party special needs trust. First party because the money already belongs to Joe. The hard part with the first party trust is because it already belongs to Joe, there are a lot of rules about how this trust can be set up. And these are federal trust laws applied by the state of Arizona, and then Arizona has their own rules as well. But first party special needs trust, the big one that most of us know is that when Joe passes, if he hasn't used all the money in that first party trust, that money is going to be claimed by Altex or Medicaid for the services they provided during Joe's lifetime. And I say that incorrectly technically, because the Altex or the state is not going to make a claim for the services actually provided. We're instead what's known as a capitated rate state. So even if Joe got 10 hours of attendant care a week and he never used half of it, Joe's claim or reimbursement request will be the same as somebody who used 40 hours a week. because it's a capitated rate state, the state is paying the insurance company the same amount no matter how many services you get. So in general, to the extent we can, our goal would be to avoid a first party trust, because at the end of the day, once the state knows they're going to get what's left over, they are much harder to administer and they make a lot more rules. So for example, with a special needs trust that is first party, the trustee is going to have to get permission for every expenditure out of the trust from the All-Tex eligibility worker. I imagine many of you have also worked with All-Tex, and there are some good ones. There are also some that take a while to get back to. It's just a huge frustration. So to the extent we can, we want to avoid the use of a first party trust. In some circumstances, it's not possible. If Joe gets a settlement, we can't control that. So a first party trust is an important tool, but it's not one we want to use by choice. Similarly, an ABLE account, which we'll talk a little bit more about, is also down there. We can put first party money into an ABLE account. Right now, we're limited at $17,000 a year contributed by Joe or anyone else. It's not $17,000 per person. Now, Joe could put additional money in above the $17,000 if part of it is Joe's income earnings, but that gets a little complicated. But also an ABLE account, if there's any money left in there, the state will make a claim if Joe passes away. So typically what we're thinking about when we're planning for this is the other answer to where's the money coming from. If that money is coming from a parent, a grandparent, aunt, uncle, anybody other than Joe, we want to set up a third party trust. And that means Mary and her husband go to see a lawyer, they do a will or a trust, and they say, you know, everything's going to go equally to my kids, but the portion that's going to go to Joe, we're going to set up some very specific language and create a third party supplemental needs, special needs, you can call it whatever you want, trust. That way, we want to make sure somebody else is managing it for Joe's benefit. It's not disqualifying him from SSI or All-Tex. And importantly, with a third party trust, we can say that if Joe doesn't use it all, it's going to go back to his family or charities or whatever ultimately Mary and her husband decide. There are two different types of special needs, or I'm sorry, third party trusts. Some are sub-trusts, meaning that in your legal document, a will or a trust, it says when Joe is gone, then this trust gets created for Joe. But sometimes there's also a standalone trust, and that means at the time we're writing Mary and her husband's estate plan, we're also writing Joe's trust. It's its own document. It exists right now. We can put money in there right now. Other family members can contribute to it. Now, the other question that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about special needs trusts is, what are we protecting? So commonly, we know, if we've been paying attention, and I didn't confuse you too much, if Mary or her husband have now passed away, Joe's probably not receiving SSI anymore. He's probably receiving disabled adult child benefits, which is not as sensitive as SSI and means that maybe we don't need to use a special needs trust, or maybe we do, but it may not be SSI. Now, he may still be receiving All-Tex, and then we're still in the same boat. Sometimes people aren't, though. A third party trust, however, at the end of the day, doesn't have a ton of downsides. So if Joe is vulnerable in any way, or perhaps has limitation as to his ability to manage a large sum of money, doing an estate plan that plans for that third party trust is not necessarily a bad idea. But again, we always want to be mindful of, okay, where is the money coming from? What are our options for planning? And ultimately, what are we protecting? Because in the scenario that Joe's grandma Barb left that $50,000 life insurance benefit, and it turns out Joe's actually already receiving disabled adult child benefits or SSDI benefits and isn't on All-Tex, well, maybe we don't want to set up that first party trust. But again, we're just kind of growing our puzzle and making sure that we're figuring it out based on all the pros and cons of all of our planning opportunities. So quickly, that first party trust, the red one, the one we don't want to do, in order for it to be accurate and work in the way we need it to work, it needs to be irrevocable. It has to be established and funded before Joe is age 65. It has to be funded by assets belonging to Joe. Government agencies have a ton of oversight, and sometimes the court, depending on what the nature of the funding is. And as I mentioned, the assets at the termination of the trust are paid back to the state for services presuming he's been on benefits for a long time, their claim will exceed any amount in there. Third party, on the other hand, what I would frame as the good one, but the one we've intentionally planned for in advance, is created by a loved one on behalf of beneficiary with special needs, so a grandparent, a parent typically. It's funded by assets that do not belong to Joe. Joe's money can never go into a third-party trust, because if it does, we've got problems. It turns that third-party trust into a first-party trust. Big no-no. It also does not disrupt public benefits, and the trust maker can designate what to do with the remaining funds to other family members, charity, etc. I will also mention that because the state is not getting what's left from a third-party trust, administration is a whole heck of a lot easier. So we don't have to do that anticipated disbursement. We don't have to get permission for every little expense, as long as it meets the rules of the trust in terms of who the beneficiaries are and that it's for their benefit and according to the terms. State is or Social Security are not going to have a lot of oversight of the third party. And then finally, ABLE accounts, they can be used to hold for first or third party money. However, combined, we can't contribute more than $17,000 annually. So if, Barb grandma left 50,000, we can't put that in an ABLE account because it's over 17,000. You really can only have one ABLE account. You don't have to use the ABLE account of the state you live in. And in fact, if you're looking, there's a great national resource or guide on ABLE accounts. You can kind of compare because they're a little bit different from state to state. We had a big change in the law as it relates to ABLE accounts. I'm losing track of time, but last year, I think, which goes into effect in like 2 years, but it used to be that you had to be disabled before age 26. They're bumping that way up. If I remember correctly, it's 40s or 50s now. And again, money in the ABLE account does not disrupt benefits, and it has some unique tools or planning opportunities for Joe's income, for example. So a lot of ways we can use an ABLE account as a tool in all of this, but generally an ABLE account does not alleviate the need for a first or third party trust. So let's review. What time is it? 54. Well, probably don't have much time, but this is Joe. We're planning on grandma's $50,000. She's already gone. We need to protect SSI or Altex. Our options are put it into a first party trust. We know it's more than $17,000, so we can't put it all in there. We could put $17,000 in the ABLE account and then buy Joe a car for $33,000, and suddenly he's spent that $50,000, but that may not be the best use of his funds. We're limited in our options. If that money's coming, we got to be careful. If we put that $50,000 into the first party special needs trust and Joe's on Altex, we not only have to disclose the trust, the funding of the trust, but we also have to do an anticipated disbursement, which means every expenditure needs to be spent. Alternatively, if we've got time and we're planning for an estate plan, typically what we want to do is make sure that some portion of that estate plan that's going to go to Joe is flowing through a third party trust. And that can either be a standalone trust, meaning we create it now, or a sub trust. Depends on a lot of factors. And big picture, we've got all those opportunities to plan for all those government benefits we talked about. But what we really need to sit down and focus on when we're coming up with a plan is what benefits is Joe on? What benefits does Joe need to stay on? And how can we protect those, or are those benefits sensitive to how much money he has?
We hope you have enjoyed this webinar, and you can see that we have many more resources like this on our Zoom page and on our website. If you want to learn more about special needs trust, feel free to watch one of these videos.